The smoke had been rising for 3 days. Kael Oren had stopped counting the fires individually sometime around the second night, when the southern prefectures of Valdry's station began to burn in earnest, and the horizon became a continuous smear of orange-black that didn't fully darken even at the deepest hours. He'd stood at the observation ledge then, just as he stood here now, watching the capital of the hegemony of Verdun fold in on itself like a paper city held too close to a flame, watching 50,000 years of unbroken civilization find out, for the first time in its long dreaming existence, what it meant to lose. He was not from here. That was the first thing anyone told you when you made it far enough inside the defense perimeter to earn a meal and a cot. That was the first thing the Verdani themselves needed you to understand. You could eat their food, sleep under their sky, carry their weapons. But you were not from here, and you would never fully understand what was being lost. Kael had stopped trying to explain that he understood plenty. He was human. He was from a world that didn't have a name in the Verdani catalogs yet, because humanity had only been stumbling through the wider dark for 112 years, which the Verdani considered less than a prologue to anything worth mentioning. He was, by the reckoning of every species that had encountered his kind, improbably young, bafflingly impulsive, and constitutionally incapable of knowing when to leave a battlefield. He tightened the strap on his pack and watched a Veth cruiser break apart over the eastern spires of Valdres. The Veth had arrived 4 years ago. Not arrived, exactly. That word implied intention, direction, a decision made somewhere about where to go. The Veth didn't decide, they propagated. They spread the way a disease spreads, the way a fire spreads when it finds new fuel, expanding outward from whatever star system they'd broken first, folding space in ways that the Verdani's best temporal theorists still couldn't fully model, burning through civilizations the way a bored child burned through anthills on a summer afternoon. They were not cruel. Kael had been told this repeatedly, and he had learned to stop flinching when they said it. Cruelty implied awareness of suffering, and the Veth were not aware of suffering in any way that registered as relevant. They processed civilizations. They extracted what could be extracted. They moved on. The Verdani had been processing empires for longer than most species had been forming governments, and here they were, being processed. 4 years of war. 83 inhabited worlds lost. The kind of numbers that stopped feeling like numbers after a while and started feeling like weather, too large and too impersonal to hold in both hands at once. Kael had arrived 14 months ago on a courier vessel nobody officially knew existed, with credentials that were plausibly forged and instructions that were genuinely vague. Earth's Outreach Coalition, which was what his people called the operation when they were being diplomatic, and called the absolute bloody Chaos Brigade when they were being honest, had been watching the Veth advance for 2 years before any Verdani diplomat had thought to ask the new species in the neighborhood whether they might have anything useful to contribute. Humans had, it turned out, a few things to contribute, not ships. Their ships were embarrassing by Verdani standards. Short-ranged, heavy, slow to maneuver, designed by engineers who were still enormously proud of having gotten off their own planet without dying. Not weapons. Their weapons were creative, but creativity alone had not stopped the Veth anywhere yet. What humans had was something the Verdani kept struggling to name correctly. The closest translation was something like a deep familiarity with losing. The Verdani had never lost before, not completely. Not the kind of losing that strips you to the bone and forces you to decide, at the very bottom of yourself, what you are actually made of. They had won wars, absorbed rivals, outlasted competitors. Their history was a continuous victory scroll, and they had built their entire military doctrine on assumptions that victory was the natural state of affairs, and defeat was a temporary anomaly to be corrected. They had no playbook for this. Humans had nothing but that playbook. Kael turned from the ledge when he heard the boots behind him. 2 sets, one heavier, moving at different rhythms. He didn't reach for his weapon. He'd learned to distinguish the footfalls of the Verdani from the footfalls of the Veth scout forms by the second month. Verdani walked like they had time, long-limbed and unhurried, because for 50,000 years they had been right about that. Commander Seveth looked like she always looked. Tall, silver gray, the bioluminescent tracery along her jawline dim with exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that had sunk past the body into something deeper. She had been commanding the Valdres defense for 19 months. She had been magnificent at it. She had also, in the last 3 days, sent 412 soldiers to die buying time that had not, in the end, been enough. She stopped 2 meters away. The other set of boots belonged to a young soldier, barely past what the Verdani called second maturation, which placed him somewhere in his early 30s, by Kale's rough calculation, carrying a kit bag that rattled slightly when he walked. Orin. Seveth's voice carried the particular flatness that he had come to recognize as grief working hard to stay tactical. The eastern corridor is closed. I know. We have a window. 19 minutes, she paused. Possibly less. Kale looked back at the city. Somewhere in the middle distance, a defense tower was firing in long, sustained bursts at something he couldn't see from here, its beam painting blue-white lines across the smoke. While he watched, it stopped. The silence from that direction was immediate and complete, the way silence gets when something has been subtracted from the world permanently. Veth have found the subterranean channels, he said. 12 minutes ago. We have 3 routes remaining. 2 of them pass through contested sectors. She folded her hands in the Verdani gesture that had no direct translation, something between a formal acknowledgement and an apology. I am asking you to take one of the contested routes. He looked at her. There is a sensor relay, she said, 7 kilometers northeast. If it remains active, the Veth cannot complete their lock on the upper atmospheric channels. If they complete that lock, the evacuation vessels in the high atmosphere cannot hold position long enough to take on civilians. She said the word civilians, the way soldiers everywhere in the universe said it, like a weight, like a debt, like the thing you reminded yourself you were still doing all of this for. The relay will be attacked within the next 20 minutes. We have no one left to hold it. Kale thought about the 412. He thought about the tower that had just stopped firing. What does holding it actually mean, he said. What do I need to do? It was the young soldier who errants, stepping forward and unshouldering his kit. The relay has a manual override housing. If the housing is damaged, which it will be, the Veth will target it specifically. The reseat can still be maintained from the secondary terminal inside the access bunker, but the secondary terminal requires continuous manual input to stay synchronized. Someone has to be there. Someone has to keep keying the synchronization sequence. For how long? Until the last evacuation vessel clears the atmospheric threshold. The young soldier met his eyes steadily. 40 minutes. Approximately. And the Veth will be trying to stop that. Yes. Kale looked at the kit bag. What's in there? The young soldier set it down and opened it. Inside, a standard Verdani sidearm charge pack at capacity. A combat blade, ceramic-edged, the kind the Verdani called a short tooth because it was designed for close work in confined spaces. 3 smoke canisters. Not Verdani manufacture, he noticed. The markings on the side were in a script he recognized. Human manufacture. Someone had thought ahead. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a signal-dampening sleeve, a small device he didn't recognize. Flat, about the size of his palm, with a single activation stud and a faint blue indicator light. What's that, he said. The young soldier hesitated. It was Seveth who answered. A wayfinder, she said. It was the Commander General's. He was killed in the eastern sector 6 hours ago. She said it without ceremony. The Fade, you said things that were too large for ceremony. It is a one-use transport device. Emergency use only. It will bring you to the nearest friendly vessel. Or the nearest living person with whom you have an established temporal link. The Commander General had established such a link with his second. She is currently aboard the primary evacuation command ship. Kale picked up the wayfinder and turned it over in his hands. Lightweight. Built carefully, the way things got built when the people building them understood that their work might be someone's last option. Emergency use, he repeated. When there is no other choice, Seveth said. When the relay has been held long enough, and there is nothing left to hold. He looked at her. The bioluminescence along her jaw flickered once, a response she couldn't fully control, which in the Verdani meant something between grief and respect, though the two were apparently quite close together in their emotional vocabulary. If I use it before the vessels clear, then the relay goes dark and the vessels cannot hold position. She held his gaze. I am not telling you when to use it, Orin. I am only telling you that it exists. A pause. The Commander General was going to hold as long as he could. Kale pocketed the wayfinder. He picked up the sidearm, checked the charge, holstered it, took the blade and clipped it to his belt, looked at the smoke canisters and put 2 of them in his pack and gave one back to the young soldier. What's your name, he said. The young soldier blinked. It was apparently not a question he had expected. Van. Kale shouldered his pack. Take the commander to the extraction point. Keep her alive. That's what matters after I leave. Seveth made a sound that might have been protest. He was already walking. The northeast corridor had been a commercial transit artery once. He could still see the faded route markers on the tunnel walls, advertising the transit times between Valdris Station and the Outer Ring. Prices in denominations that no longer meant anything. The lights were out except for the emergency strips, which cast everything in a red dim that was either dramatic or ominous, depending on how you felt about your chances. Cale felt fine about his chances. He had always felt fine about his chances, which had alarmed every military psychologist who had ever evaluated him. Because feeling fine about your chances was either the mark of a highly calibrated risk assessment or a specific kind of madness, and the psychologists could never quite determine which applied to him. He moved at a steady jog, pack riding easy, watching the corners. The Veth scout forms were not large. Nothing like the cruisers overhead, which were city-sized and moved with a horrible slow grace. The way things moved when they were too big to need to hurry. The scout forms were roughly humanoid. Roughly, in the way that a diagram of a human is roughly human. All the proportions slightly wrong. The limbs too long and jointed in places that implied a different gravity. The sensory clusters at the top of the head framed in a bony lattice that served the function of a face without being one. They communicated through resonance patterns that the Verdani called the lattice tongue, which humans experienced as a pressure behind the eyes and a faint taste of copper. He'd learned to recognize it 3 months ago. He was recognizing it now. He stopped, pressed himself against the wall, let his heartbeat settle to something manageable. Not calm, exactly, but the specific quality of alertness that felt like calm from the outside. He waited. 2 of them came around the corner ahead, moving in the unhurried way of things that did not expect resistance. That was the thing about the Veth that humans had identified early on in the first analysis reports that had circulated through the Outreach Coalition. They were not strategists in the sense that strategists needed to be. They had never fought anything that resisted meaningfully, so they had never developed the deep animal instinct for threat assessment that came from long experience of being surprised. They swept and they extracted and they moved on. They were very good at the thing they had always done, and they had never needed to get good at anything else. Cale waited until the lead scout form was 4 meters away, and then he moved. Not toward it. That was the mistake everyone made with the Veth, trying to match their resilience directly. He moved laterally, under the reach of the lattice face before the sensory clusters could lock onto the heat signature, and the blade came out and found the junction where the scout form's primary mobility node connected to its lower chassis. A spot the Verdani technicians had started calling the throat, which wasn't accurate anatomically, but was accurate in terms of function. The scout form folded. The second one pivoted, faster than the first, and he was already moving again, pulling one of the smoke canisters and cracking it against the wall to activate it as he rolled past the second form's reach. The canister wasn't smoke exactly. It was a signal disruption aerosol the Verdani had developed in the first year of the war to confuse the lattice tongue. The second scout form's movements became jerky, uncoordinated, the resonance patterns breaking up. Cale put 2 shots from the sidearm into its mobility node and kept running. He came up the service stairs 3 at a time and burst through a door, marked with the relay station's access glyph, into the open air for a moment. Just a moment. The route above ground was 300 meters, and the sky above him was extraordinary and terrible. The cruisers moved like slow stars, leaving trails of disintegrated matter behind them, where they'd processed whatever they'd processed. Below them, the city burned in long ribbons of fire and smoke, and somewhere high above all of it, visible only as distant points of light against the brown-gray pall, the evacuation vessels were holding position, waiting, burning fuel they could not afford to waste, while the timer ran down on whether there would be anyone left below to evacuate. He thought about the 412. He kept running. The relay bunker was a squat building that had clearly been designed by engineers who cared more about function than anything else. Reinforced, half buried in the foundations of a larger structure that no longer existed, connected to the main relay tower by a cable housing thick enough to walk across if you needed to. The main tower was still standing, which surprised him. He'd expected more damage. The Veth hadn't gotten here yet. They would. He found the access panel and got inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and stood in the dark for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Emergency lighting came up, the same red dim as the tunnels below. The secondary terminal was where Vayan had said it would be, a flat panel with a simple interface, a sequence display, a manual input pad. Instructions etched into the panel in Verdani script, which he could read now after 14 months, though he still thought in English. He sat down, found the synchronization sequence in the terminal's memory, and began to key it in. It was not complicated. That was almost the worst part of it. The sequence was about 40 keystrokes, and the terminal needed it re-entered every 90 seconds to maintain sync with the relay above. 40 keystrokes every 90 seconds for 40 minutes. A child could have done it. The reason a child wasn't doing it was because somewhere outside, the Veth were going to arrive and try to stop it. And the person at the terminal couldn't both key the sequence and also prevent the Veth from terminating the sequence. The Verdani had designed the system this way because it had never occurred to them that they would need to defend it with only one person. Kale thought about that as he keyed the sequence for the first time. He thought about the way human warfare had evolved across thousands of years on a planet that offered no mercy to the unprepared. The way that scarcity and competition, and the simple grinding fact of being mortal in an indifferent universe, had produced, over centuries of hard experience, a species that was genuinely good at doing impossible things with insufficient resources. He thought about Thermopylae, and the Alamo, and the underground bunkers of Warsaw, and 100 other places whose names had never made it into any Verdani catalog. He thought about the human talent for the doomed last stand, and how that talent had always seemed from the outside like tragedy, but how it had also, again and again and again throughout the long violent history of his people, turned out to be the thing that bought enough time for everything else. The terminal beeped, 90 seconds. He keyed the sequence again. He heard the first impact outside 4 minutes later. The Veth came through the wall on the western side, which was not the side he'd been watching. He'd been watching the door, which was a mistake that a more experienced soldier in this specific situation would not have made, but which was also the most natural mistake in the world, because doors were where things came through, and walls were where things didn't. The wall was where they came through. 3 of them. Their entry point a jagged hole through 3 layers of reinforced composite. The building's structural integrity groaning around it. Kale was at the terminal, keyed the sequence. 30 seconds into the interval, 60 seconds remaining, and came up out of the chair and behind the terminal housing before the lead form had fully oriented. The lattice tongue pressure was immediate and strong with 3 sources in a small space. He felt it like a hand pressing on the back of his skull, like the beginning of a bad headache, like something trying to tune into a frequency he wasn't broadcasting on. He pressed his back against the terminal housing, sidearm up, and did the calculation. 3 forms, 1 room, 1 terminal he needed to keep reaching, 60 seconds until the next sequence entry. 47 now. The first form moved toward the terminal directly, ignoring him. It had identified the relay signal, the thing it was here to stop, and it was processing with the Veth's characteristic focus that was almost indistinguishable from tunnel vision. He let it go for the terminal. He shot the second form in the mobility node as it turned toward him, stepped past it as it collapsed, and put himself between the third form and the terminal. At the same moment the first form reached it. The third form was faster than he'd expected. It caught him across the shoulder with a limb strike that spun him sideways, and he went down hard on one knee, and the terminal beeped. He was back up before the beep finished, catching himself on the housing, and keyed the sequence with his offhand because his right shoulder was singing a high note he chose to ignore. 38 keystrokes, almost missed 2, got them. Full sync maintained and turned. The first form had touched the terminal. It had not understood the manual sync requirement. The Veth processed automated systems, not deliberate human hands on manual keys, and the deliberateness of the input apparently registered to their lattice sensors as interference pattern rather than signal. The form was still standing at the terminal, working through this, while Kale addressed the third form. He addressed it with the blade, which was blunt and brutal and exactly sufficient, and then turned to the first form and addressed it with the sidearm at 3 meters, because he didn't have time to be elegant. The room went quiet except for the drip of something from the hole in the wall and his own breathing, and the terminal's patient countdown. He keyed the next sequence at 81 seconds, and then leaned against the housing and took stock. Shoulder, bad. Not broken, he could rotate it through the full range with only moderate consideration of how much that hurt. Dislocated probably, or partially dislocated. He'd had worse. The issue was that it would slow him down, and it would make the next attack harder to manage. And there was going to be a next attack, because there were always more Veth. That was the thing about the Veth. That was that was burning every world it touched. There were always more of them coming. He thought about the wayfinder in his pocket. He took it out and held it for a moment. The indicator light was still blue, patient, waiting. 42 minutes since he'd entered the building. Still had time to reach altitude. The evacuation vessels were still holding, or they would have gotten word somehow. The terminal would have flagged it, he thought, if the relay had been breached elsewhere. He put the wayfinder away. He keyed the sequence. They came again, at the 18-minute mark, through the same wall and also through the ceiling, which he had not anticipated but probably should have. Because ceiling entries were in the tactical literature, and he'd just been distracted by the shoulder. 4 forms this time, 2 from the wall, 2 dropping through a breach they'd made in the overhead plating. The next 90 seconds were very full. He used the last smoke canister, and the disruption aerosol bought him about 40 seconds of confused movement from the ceiling entry forms, which was enough to deal with the wall entry forms in the aggressive manner the situation required. And then the aerosol cleared, and he was down to 2, and the terminal was beeping. And he was keying the sequence with one eye on the display and one eye on the forms, and his shoulder was not improving. He finished the sequence. The nearer form hit the terminal, housing hard enough to crack it. The display flickered. He felt his stomach drop. The specific cold freefall of a person who has just watched the thing they were doing this for possibly stop working. And then the display steadied, and the sync indicator held green, and he let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He put down the farther form. He put down the nearer form with effort, because it was larger than the others had been, and his right arm was now less useful than it should have been, and the ceramic blade was not a forgiving tool for the amount of work he was asking it to do. He sat down against the housing. The terminal beeped at him. He keyed the sequence. 31 minutes. He thought about 31 minutes. He thought about whether 31 minutes was a reasonable thing for one person to hold against. Whatever came through next, in a room with a cracked housing, and a compromised right shoulder and a side arm that was down to 32% charge. He thought about the wayfinder. Then he thought about the evacuation vessels in the high atmosphere, burning their position fuel, loaded with what remained of Valdra Station's civilian population. The ones who'd made it this far, the ones who were still alive because 412 soldiers had died in the eastern sector, and because Commander Seveth had found a human who didn't know when to leave a battlefield. He thought about what it meant to be the only one left who could do the thing that needed doing. He thought about every world his people had come from, every hard lesson that had been bought at costs no one would ever finish paying. Every person throughout the long human story who had sat in a dark room and decided that the people outside the room mattered more than the pain inside it. The Veth had been processing civilizations for 1,000 years without ever encountering a species for whom losing was a familiar language. They had never met anything that got better at a fight as the fight got worse, because the species they had encountered had built their survival strategies on the reasonable assumption that they were the most capable things in the neighborhood. And when that assumption failed, they failed with it. Humans had never had that assumption to begin with. Kale keyed the sequence. At the 23-minute mark, they tried something different. No forms came through the wall. Instead, the relay tower outside, he could hear it happening. The specific deep resonance of a Veth field projector cycling up began to be actively disassembled. The cable housing connecting it to the terminal groaned and started to compress. The Veth, working from the outside to sever the physical connection that the manual sync was maintaining. He had about 4 feet before the cable sheared. He went out. The door, not the wall. The door was fine for going out through. He hit it at a run and came out into the orange-black air, and the smoke, and the distant continuous sound of the city dying. And the relay tower was 30 meters away. And there were 5 forms around its base, with a projector array between them, that was doing what projector arrays did when they were trying to accelerate the decomposition of a reinforced cable housing. He thought about this for less than a second. He did not have enough charge left for 5 clean shots, and his shoulder made close work a generous hope rather than a reasonable plan. And the projector array was the priority. Destroy the array. The cable decompression stopped. The relay held for whatever time remained. He had, by his count, slightly under 17 minutes of sync requirement left before the evacuation vessels would clear the atmospheric threshold. He used the sidearm on the array, and it worked. The array blew apart in a chain detonation that was more than he'd aimed for. The Veth apparently hadn't expected anyone to be shooting at it from the outside, because they'd built their defensive orientation inward toward the tower, which told him something about the limits of always fighting things that came to you rather than things that came for you. The 5 forms turned, he ran. Back through the door, back to the terminal, keyed the sequence at 89 seconds. 1 second from lapse, which he chose to call acceptable, and then braced the door with the remains of one of the housings from the earlier entry forms, which would not stop anything meaningfully, but would slow it by 5 seconds. And 5 seconds was worth something. He was bleeding from somewhere on his left side, which he noticed distantly, the way you notice things that you didn't have bandwidth to deal with yet. He filed it under later. He keyed the sequence and pressed his back against the housing and thought about 17 minutes. 17 minutes. He could hear more projectors cycling up outside. He could hear the cruisers moving overhead, the low harmonic that you felt in the chest before you heard it, the sound of something too large operating too close. He could hear Valdris Station finishing its process of becoming something the Veth had already moved past. He thought about a woman named Seveth, who was maybe an hour's walk from here, moving toward an extraction point with a young soldier named Vayan, and who had looked at him with bioluminescence flickering in grief and respect, because she had given him a one-way errand, and she knew it. He thought about how the Verdani had never had a word for this, for the specific human thing of walking toward the place everyone else was walking away from, and finding in that walk not despair, but something almost like clarity, the particular clean feeling of being exactly where the moment needed you to be, doing exactly the impossible thing that needed doing. He wasn't sure his people had a word for it either, fully, but they'd had the practice of it. For as long as there had been humans, there had been this. Someone in a dark place, holding something that mattered, deciding that it was worth the cost of holding it. The terminal beeped. He keyed the sequence. The wall came down at the 11-minute mark, the full western face of it, the Veth apparently done with the subtlety of form entries, and moving to broader structural removal. He had time to get behind the terminal housing before the wall became rubble, and the terminal itself was shielded in its original installation housing, which was rated to take significant structural load. Through the gap where the wall had been, he could see the street. He could see the sky. He could see, high above the smoke and the cruisers, and the slow, terrible motion of everything burning, the faint points of light that were the evacuation vessels, still there, still holding. He keyed the sequence through the dust and the structural noise, through the ringing in his ears that had started around minute 7 and hadn't stopped, through the pain from his shoulder that had graduated from a high note to a full chord, and he thought, 11 minutes. He thought, 11 minutes is not nothing. 11 minutes is full of possibility. The forms came through the gap. There were more than before. There were significantly more than before, and they were moving with something that felt different from the Veth's usual unhurried purposefulness. Something that he would have called urgency if he'd been attributing emotional states, which he tried not to do with the Veth, but which he was going to call urgency anyway, because the evidence for it was substantial. He realized with a cold precision that felt a little like joy what that meant. They were trying to stop him specifically now. Not the relay, not the terminal, not the abstract process of maintaining a signal. They were coming for him. For the human with the manual input, the variable they had not accounted for, the element that did not fit their processing model, because they had never encountered an element quite like it before. They had been fighting civilizations that broke when their infrastructure broke. They had never fought anything that was the infrastructure. He put the USAID arm on the terminal housing. Last 12% charge. He was going to need it for close work. He picked up the blade. The first form crossed the rubble line. He moved. What happened in the next 9 minutes was not something he could have reconstructed with precision afterward. He remembered it in pieces. The specific angle of a shot that bought him 3 more seconds of distance. The moment the sidearm clicked empty and he threw it at something, because it was still good for that. The cold, clean simplicity of the blade doing work. The terminal beeping through all of it in its patient 90-second rhythm. Him answering it every time. He answered it from the floor once, after something hit him in the side, and he didn't fully get up before the beep came. He keyed the sequence from one knee with his face a foot from the panel and got back up. He answered it with his left hand when his right arm stopped being reliable. He answered it bloody and ringing and running on something that was past adrenaline, something older and quieter and more stubborn. The specific kind of human determination that has no drama in it, that doesn't announce itself, that just keeps going, because stopping hasn't been decided yet. He answered it. He answered it. He answered it. At 2 minutes remaining, the room was very still. The forms that had come were no longer a problem he needed to address. The wall was mostly gone. The terminal housing was cracked in 3 places, but the display was green, sync maintained, the relay above him still singing its signal up through the brown-gray sky to the vessels that needed it. He was sitting on the floor against what remained of the housing, because standing had become optional. He took the wayfinder out. The indicator light was still blue. He looked at it for a moment. The careful workmanship, the weight of a thing made to be someone's last option. The one thing you held in reserve against the worst case, and used only when the worst case had fully arrived. He thought about the commander general who had carried it. He thought about the second, aboard the command ship, who now had a link that was going to activate in 2 minutes if he made the call that the commander general hadn't lived to make. He thought, there is no shame in survival. That was another human lesson, a harder one, learned across the same long history as all the others. The willingness to spend yourself entirely was worth exactly nothing if it was the whole vocabulary. The point was never the dying. The point was always the thing you were doing while you stayed alive long enough to do it. The terminal beeped. He keyed the sequence for the last time. The display showed the sync count, 2 more entries required. 180 seconds, he held the wayfinder. He waited. The second to last beep came and he keyed it. The display updated. 1 entry remaining. Outside through the collapsed wall, he could see the vessels. They were moving now, slowly, maintaining the careful geometry of a coordinated high-atmosphere transit, but moving, which meant they were clearing the threshold, which meant the relay had held long enough, which meant it was done, which meant now. He pressed the activation stud. The world changed. It did not change gradually or cinematically. It changed the way teleport technology always changed the world, which is to say instantly and without consultation, one context replaced by another between one heartbeat and the next. The bunker was gone. The dust and the blood, and the rubble and the distant sound of Valdres Station burning were gone. He was standing in a corridor that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and the faint chemical scent of an infirmary station. And the light was white and steady, and nothing was on fire. He sat down on the floor because the floor was here, and he needed it. A woman appeared at the far end of the corridor. Verdani, older, her bioluminescence pulsing rapid and irregular in the way he now recognized as shock responding to information. She was looking at him with an expression he had no cultural framework for, and then she was running toward him, calling something in Verdani that was too fast for him to follow, and behind her came 2 medics and a crash cart, and the general organized chaos of people who had been waiting for news that had not been good. He sat on the floor and breathed. The vessels were clear. The relay had held. The people who had been inside that evacuation window were now through it, carried up into the dark by the signal from a bunker that was now empty, its last occupant having used his last option at the last possible moment, and found on the other side of it the same universe he'd left. The same stars, the same 4 still ongoing, the same vast and unresolved question of whether anything his species contributed to this fight would matter in the end. He thought it might. He thought that every time a species encountered the Veth and was processed, the Veth learned slightly less about what was possible, and every time a species encountered the Veth and was not processed, or not entirely, not yet, not without cost, the Veth learned something they had not known before, that there were things that did not break when their infrastructure broke, that there were elements that refused to fit the processing model, that somewhere in the dark, after 1,000 years of uncontested expansion, they had finally found something strange and stubborn and constitutionally incapable of knowing when to leave a battlefield. They had found humans, and humans as a rule did not come to a fight with the expectation of perfect outcomes. They came to a fight with a blade and a plan, and a deeply held suspicion that the other side had made some assumptions that were about to become expensive. The medic was saying his name. He looked up. Oren. She was kneeling in front of him, hands moving in the professional efficiency of someone doing triage. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," he said. His voice was rougher than he'd expected. "Is Siveth?" "Commander Siveth is aboard. She arrived 20 minutes ago." The medic's bioluminescence was steady, which he'd learned meant focused calm. "She is asking for you." He tried to get up. The medic stopped him with a hand on his good shoulder. "Not yet," she said. "In a moment." He leaned back against the wall, In a moment he had some of those now. He had a future that had not been guaranteed 90 seconds ago, and the fact of it was large and quiet and a little overwhelming. The way futures always felt when you'd been spending the last portion of your attention entirely in the present. He thought about the relay tower, still standing above a burning city, still singing its signal to empty air now that the vessels had gone. He thought about the bunker empty now, the terminal still patiently beeping at no one, the sequence lapsing without a hand to key it. He thought about what Seveth had said. Even a warrior knows when it's time to leave the battlefield. He thought yes, but knowing when is the hard part, and you had to stay long enough to know. 40 minutes later he was in the infirmary, and Seveth was standing at the foot of the bed, the bioluminescence in her jaw still dim but steadier than it had been on the cliff ledge over Valdris. Behind her, through the infirmary's narrow viewport, the stars were different from the stars over Gallifrey Station. They were moving away from them. The evacuation fleet in transit, putting distance between themselves and what had been. The relay held, he said. It wasn't really a question. He knew it had. It held. She was quiet for a moment. Every vessel that was in the atmosphere window cleared the threshold. 41,812 people. He absorbed that number. It was a very different kind of number from 412. Van, he said, here. He's well. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile. The Verdani equivalent was a different expression, but in the vicinity. He wanted to come with me. I told him to let you sleep first. Kale looked at the viewport, the stars moving past, the long dark between one place and wherever they were going. What happens now? He said. Seveth folded her hands. He recognized the gesture, the formal acknowledgement, the apology, the weight of what came next. Now we reassemble. Now we contact the remaining hegemony fleets. Now we ask what can be salvaged from what we have and how it might be used. She paused. And now I think we listen more carefully to what you have been trying to tell us. About the playbook, he said. About the playbook. She looked at him steadily. Your people have something we lack, Orin. Not technology, not numbers, something else. She searched for the word fluency. With losing, yes, as I have heard you say, but also a fluency with what comes after losing, with continuation, with the specific art of being diminished and remaining. She held his gaze. We have not had reason to develop that art. We are beginning to understand that we need it. He thought about that. Thought about all of human history, distilled into something useful, something transferable. 50,000 years of Verdani civilization, learning in the worst possible classroom. What humanity had learned in the first hard chapters of its own story. It's not an art, he said. Not exactly. It's more of a habit, a practice. You do it enough times, it stops feeling like the exception and starts feeling like just how things go. Things get hard and you stay in them, and then you figure out the next thing. He paused. The hard part is the first few times. After that, it's just how you are. Seveth was quiet for a long moment. You stayed in that bunker, she said. You stayed when any reasonable assessment of the situation said to use the Wayfinder. The vessels weren't clear yet. They might have cleared without you. He shook his head slowly. Might have is a very expensive way to find out, especially when the people paying for it aren't you. She was quiet again. Outside, the stars kept moving. 41,812, she said softly. That is what you bought. That's what we bought, he said. Every person who died in the eastern sector. Every person who held anything they were asked to hold for, as long as they could hold it. He looked at the stars. I just happened to be the last one holding. The infirmary was quiet. Somewhere in the ship, engines ran their constant low note, the sound of momentum, of forward motion, of a future in progress. Sleep, Seveth said. We will talk more when you are able. She moved to leave. At the door she stopped and turned. Orin, she said, the Commander General's Wayfinder. A pause. It was calibrated to reach the nearest person with whom a temporal link existed. When you activated it. She stopped again. The Commander General had no link with anyone aboard this vessel. The Wayfinder should have found the link to his second and brought you to her position. Another pause, longer. His second died in the eastern sector 4 hours before he did. Kale looked at her. The Wayfinder brought you here anyway, Seveth said. To the nearest person it could reach. Her bioluminescence pulsed once, grief and respect, side by side in the same light. I do not fully understand how that is possible. He thought about it. He thought about the careful workmanship of the device. He thought about what it meant to build a thing to find someone, and what the thing did when the someone it was meant for wasn't there, and whether the gap between expected parameters and actual outcome said something about the device, or something about the circumstances, or something about the specific quality of a person who had just spent 17 minutes declining to leave a place where leaving would have meant abandonment. He thought about the long, stubborn human habit of finding a way. "I guess it improvised," he said. Seveth looked at him for a moment longer. Then she left him to the stars and the quiet and the forward motion of a fleet that had no home to return to and was going anyway. The way things went when they had learned, or were learning, slowly, at great cost, in the hardest possible classroom. That continuation was not the same as victory, but that continuation was what made victory eventually possible. He slept. Outside, the stars moved through the dark, indifferent and beautiful, and exactly as far away as they had always been, waiting for the things that were coming to reach them. The things that were coming were still coming. They always were, but then so were the humans.